So we'll see what he does next week. But right now, I believe we're still in the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 50. Genesis chapter 50 tonight. And we're going to read several verses here and try to give you the thought the Lord put on our hearts for the service tonight. Genesis chapter 50, we'll begin reading in verse number 14. Genesis chapter 50, verse 14, the Bible says, "And Joseph returned into Egypt, he and his brethren, and all that went up with him to bury his father after he had buried his father. And when Joseph's brethren saw that their father was dead, they said, Joseph will peradventure hate us, and will certainly requite us all the evil that we did unto him. And they sent a messenger unto Joseph, saying, Thy father did command before he died, saying, So shall ye say to Joseph, Forgive, I pray thee now, the trespasses of thy brethren and their sin, for they did unto thee evil. Now we pray thee, forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of thy father. And Joseph wept when they spake unto him. And his brethren also went out and fell down before his face, and they said, Behold, we be thy servants. And Joseph said unto them, Fear not, for I am in the place of God. But as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. Now therefore fear ye not, I will nourish you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spake kindly unto them. And Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's house. And Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation, and the children of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were brought up upon Joseph's knees. And Joseph said unto his brethren, I die, and God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land into the land which I swear unto Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones from hence. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. For the last several weeks, we have been looking at the life of Joseph, and I have enjoyed studying and looking at the life of this man. And we've looked at so many truths that we can learn from the life of this young man, or this man Joseph. And we saw how on numerous occasions that Joseph was a picture of Christ. And we've seen that in several different ways and in several different areas of his life, how he pictured Jesus Christ. As I thought about Joseph, I thought about how that he truly was surrendered to the will of God. He had surrendered his life. He whatever God wanted, that's what he wanted to do. We see that all throughout his life, he lives that surrender life. But he also, I believe, he was truly faithful to the will of God. He was faithful to do what God had called him to do. He was faithful everywhere that you find Joseph, you find him being faithful. And he was obedient to the will of God. He was obedient in every part. He did what God wanted him to do. Can I tell you, Joseph is someone that you and I as Christians should look at to pattern our lives after. Say, I want to be like Joseph. Some of the things that we've looked at, man, it would be good for us to be like Joseph. And again, this week we're looking at this story of this young man. And the other morning, the Lord impressed upon me something else in this story that we've not looked at thus far. For weeks now, again, we've looked at different areas of Joseph's life. We've saw how that God was working in Joseph's life. We've seen how that he was forgiving his brothers. He had forgiveness in his heart. We saw how Brother Tom, God providentially worked in his life all through to get him where God wanted him to be. And we saw even last week of Joseph being good and blessing his brothers even when they didn't deserve it. But I believe tonight the Lord would have us to look at this story a little bit differently. I don't want us to focus on Joseph tonight as much as I want us to focus on Joseph's God. And tonight I'm preaching on this thought, Joseph's faithful God. Joseph's faithful God. Can I tell you, I'm thankful for all the lessons that we have looked at and that we can learn from the life of Joseph. But there's a great lesson in the life of Joseph that we learn about God. And that great lesson that we learn in Joseph's life is that that God was faithful. God was faithful to Joseph. All throughout this story, you find God time and time again being faithful. So for a few minutes tonight, I want us to look at this thought of Joseph's faithful God. Joseph's faithful God. The first thing I want us to notice that the Lord impressed upon my heart was His faithful presence. His faithful presence. We find the Lord's faithful presence in Joseph's life. No matter where you find Joseph, no matter the situation, whether he's in a prison or Potiphar's house or even Pharaoh's palace, God is faithful to Joseph. He is faithful. We find Him faithful in His presence in Joseph's life. I began to think about this story and kind of go through it in my mind from the beginning to the end. And I thought about how that He was faithful when Joseph was at home. He was faithful. God is the one who sent Joseph those dreams, and God was faithful to Joseph as a young boy in his father's house. Can I tell you, God was also faithful to Joseph when He sent him to check on his brethren. Can I tell you said, preacher, where was God's faithfulness there? He didn't allow his brothers to kill him. A couple of his brothers wanted to kill him. He said, well, preacher, I thought that the brothers stepped in the way and said, hey, don't kill him. I believe that was God being faithful. I believe that was God working in that brother's heart. Because, hey, look, it says his brothers hated him. That brother hated him just like the rest of them did. But God was faithful and said, no, you're not going to take his life. We see God being faithful here. God was faithful when Joseph was in the pit. I thought about the verse. I even went and looked it up again. Let me read it to you. Genesis chapter 37, verse 24 says this, and they took him and cast him into a pit. And the pit was empty and there was no water in it. I thought, you said, preacher, what are you talking about there? I began to think that they may have thought that pit was empty, but that pit wasn't empty, Brother Tom. That pit was full of the presence of God. God was in that pit with Joseph. I thought about Daniel in the lion's den. When they threw Daniel in the lion's den, they thought surely those lions were going to eat him alive. But no, God was there with him. God was faithful. His presence was faithful with Joseph even in the pit. Joseph was he was faithful as Joseph is sold into slavery. Can I tell you, I believe God sent the right people by because God knew where He needed him to be. God needed him down in Egypt. He needed him to get down to Egypt, to get to Potiphar's house. That was part of God's plan. So He sent these gentlemen by that would purchase Joseph as a slave. These people would be the vehicle that God would use to get Joseph where God wanted him. We see God's faithfulness even as he's sold as a slave. We find God faithful to Joseph in Potiphar's house. Numerous times you will find in chapter 39 when Joseph gets to Potiphar's house, you'll find a phrase like this in what it says in verse number 2. And the Lord was with Joseph. Verse number 3, the Bible says this, and his master saw, speaking of Pharaoh, his master saw that the Lord was with Joseph. Joseph's away from home. He's in a foreign land. But one thing he finds comfort in, that, hey, God is still here. The Lord is with me. We find God being faithful in Joseph's life by His presence. Can I tell you, He was with Joseph in the moment of his temptation. When Potiphar's wife comes and tries to seduce Joseph, God was with him. He said, preacher, prove it. Well, I believe God was faithful in providing a way of escape. I thought of that verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13 that says this, there hath no temptation taken you, but such is common to man. But God is faithful and will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape that ye may be able to bear it. I believe we see God's faithfulness in His presence there in that temptation. When Potiphar's wife comes in and tempts him, God's there and says, Joseph, there's the way of escape. Take it. And Joseph takes the way of escape. God is present. Can I tell you, he was with Joseph in prison. You'll find at the end of chapter 39, because of this lie that's been told upon him, because of these false accusations, he is cast into the prison. But the Bible tells you in verse 21 of chapter 39, but the Lord was with Joseph. Hey, God just doesn't show up in Potiphar's house. He doesn't just show up in temptation. But thank God, when Joseph is thrown into prison for doing what was right, God says, I'll meet you there too. I think you're probably now getting where I'm going tonight. God is present in our lives. He's faithful. And can I tell you, he was faithful with Joseph in Pharaoh's palace. We've seen all these different aspects of Joseph's life, but we find him faithful. Genesis chapter 41, verse 38 says this, and Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? Pharaoh could see God in Joseph's life. God was very present. God was very present. Can I tell you, he was with Joseph as he faced his brothers. Remember his brothers, we talked about that, how they came to him. It was only the presence of God, Brother Tom, I believe, that could cause him to offer them that forgiveness we talked about. That mercy that we talked about, that grace was God's presence. God was still with Joseph, even in Pharaoh's palace. Everywhere you look throughout this short story we find of Joseph in these, about 14 or about 15 chapters or so, we find here Joseph's life. And all throughout it, you find one thing that is consistent, one thing that Joseph could count on. He couldn't count on his family. He couldn't count on his home. He was in a foreign land at times. He was in prison at times. One thing he could count on was that the fact that God would be faithful. Wherever he'd go, God was there. Wherever he'd find himself, wherever he may wake up the next morning. Sometimes I believe Joseph probably wondered, this has kind of been an interesting day. I wonder where I'll end up tomorrow. But one thing he found consistent was he found God. Can you imagine, Brother Tom, being just thinking about how he was in Potiphar's house and God was with him? Potiphar saw that. He's falsely accused. He's thrown into prison. You ever think that maybe this thought crossed my mind? I wonder if God will be there. And then we read, hey, God was with him. God was with Joseph even in the prison. God's faithful presence. Can I tell you that those of us who are saved tonight, we can be assured and we can take comfort in knowing that God is with us everywhere he leads us. The Lord, as he leads us through our day, as he leads us through this life, as he leads us at times to take a step of faith, to trust him, and times of uncertainty, times where we don't understand, we can rest assured tonight that God's faithful presence will be there. That's how we face tomorrow, Brother Clarence. We don't know what tomorrow holds, but one thing we can bank on is tomorrow God will be present. The child of God, how does the child of God have hope when everything seems so hopeless around us? Because we know that God is present. God is present in our lives. He'll be there today. He's here today. He'll be with, if he gives us tomorrow, he'll be here tomorrow. If he gives us next year, he's already there. He'll be with us. Hey, tomorrow, if the sun is shining, God's presence will be in your life. Tomorrow, if the storm clouds are rolling in your life and you're facing a great storm, can I tell you, you'll find that God is present. We can be assured that everywhere he leads us, he is present. Sometimes he leads us into those dark places. As he led Joseph into that pit, Joseph in that dark place in his life, Brother Tom, he found the presence of God there. Have you ever been in a place like that? Maybe not a physical pit, but you've experienced those dark times in your life where it seems like everyone has turned their back, everyone has walked away. But thank God, somewhere in the shadows, you'll find Jesus. You'll find the presence of God. He never leaves us as his children. Can I tell you, sometimes it's in those prison-like moments where we feel like we're all bound up. We feel like we can't do what we want to do for the Lord. Can I tell you, God is in those moments with us. He's there. Can I tell you, sometimes it may be hard to see him, Sister Rita, but we can rest assured that he is there. He never leaves us. He doesn't leave us. I thought about that verse, Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5. Let your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with such things as you have. For he hath said, Who is He? God. Jesus has said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. Hey, that is a promise of God. He has signed it. He said, He said it. You can take it to the bank and you can cash it. It's good. That promise is good tonight. It'll be good tomorrow. It don't matter who's in the White House. It don't matter what the stock market does tomorrow. God will be with us. He's present in our lives. Can I tell you, He was with Joseph? And can I tell you tonight, as a child of God, one thing you'll find about your God and our God is that He is faithful in His presence. He's always there when we need Him. In the darkness of night, when you have no one else to talk to, thank the Lord He's there. Thank the Lord for His presence. We see Joseph's faithful God. We see His faithful presence in Joseph's life. But let me share this second thing with you. Not only His faithful presence, but His faithful piloting. His faithful piloting. Can I tell you, God is faithfully piloting Joseph to the place that God prepared for him. Joseph didn't understand that. I don't know about you, and it's been a while since I've seen them. I don't even know if they make them anymore, but I used to see those bumper stickers, God's my co-pilot. If He's your co-pilot, you're in trouble. But thank God He pilots our life. Thank God He leads our lives. He guides our lives. And can I tell you, though, sometimes Joseph may have thought, man, God must have made a wrong turn here. How did I end up here? Can I tell you, God never made a mistake in Joseph's life. The pit wasn't a mistake. The prison wasn't a mistake. Potiphar's house wasn't a mistake. That false accusation wasn't a mistake. Why? Because he needed him there, because Pharaoh was going to put some of his servants there. And Pharaoh eventually was going to have a dream. And so all of this, God was piloting, God was leading Joseph's life to get him to the place where God wanted him. Notice what verse number 19 of our text says. It says, and Joseph said to them, fear not, for am I in the place of God. Joseph, in chapter 50, verse 19, realizes he is exactly where God was taking him. When God showed him those dreams all the way back, I believe in chapter 36, 37, He shows him those dreams. Joseph never realized all the things that he'd have to go through. But standing in chapter 50, he can say, I can see God's hand piloting me, leading me, guiding me throughout this life. So many years ago, God had given him those dreams, and now Joseph is in a place where he can see that God was simply directing him. All of those things, though he didn't understand them at the time, and can I tell you, those of us who have been saved in length of time, that we can all testify, there's been some things that God has allowed, some things that God has done that we didn't understand at the time. But can I tell you, there may come a day where you'll look back and say, well, that's what God was doing. God was getting me to the place. He was in the place of God. Can I tell you, God knew where Joseph needed to be. He knew, but can I tell you, he goes a step beyond that. Not only did he know, Brother Tom, where Joseph needed to be, he knew when he needed to be there. He knew exactly when he needed to be there. Joseph didn't arrive to Pharaoh's house a day early, a day late. He arrived just when God wanted him to. God was faithful in piloting Joseph to his place. Not Joseph, but to God's place. He didn't say, Joseph, how do you want your life to be? I'm going to exalt you. How do you want to be exalted? What do you think he said? Well, put me over a kingdom. Let me rule. Give me a palace. Give me a throne. That would have been Joseph's way. But God says, I'm going to give you a pit. I'm going to put you in a prison. I'm going to do this. But then I'm going to exalt you. It was God's way, God's place. It was the place where God was leading him. Can I tell you, Joseph, again, was human just like you, just like me. He didn't always understand. We read these stories sometimes and we think, oh, he never questioned God. He never wondered. He was human like me. I'm sure he did. Brother Roger, I'm sure there were days, maybe in prison, when he wondered, God, what are you doing? I never saw myself here, but he did not always understand. But one thing he was able to do, he trusted that, hey, God is leading. And God is leading me to the place where he wants me to be. Can I tell you, just like Joseph, God is leading each and every one of us. as His children tonight. Though we may not always be able sometimes to make sense of our circumstances. Sometimes things come into our lives and some circumstances happen and we wonder, why in the world did this happen? We don't understand. Joseph didn't understand. Listen, we may not be able to make sense of it, but we must trust Him. We may not always be able to understand the way that He's leading. But His ways are above our ways. His thoughts are above our thoughts. But can I tell you one thing we can do tonight? We can trust the one who's leading us. I was thinking just now of that piloting. Look, if I go get on an airplane tomorrow, Brother Tom, I'm not going to tell the pilot how to fly that plane. Because I sure don't know how to do it. I get up in the sky, probably wouldn't know which way was north, south, east, or west. I just know which way's up and down. I don't want to go straight towards the ground. But I wouldn't try to tell. Can I tell you, that's the way in the Christian life, we shouldn't be trying to tell God how to get us where He's taking us. Some of us get in a vehicle and we trust that person who's driving us to get us to where we're going, and we trust that they know where they're going. And to get us there, look, when you get on an airplane, you trust, hey, they're going to get me to where I'm going. They're going to get me there when I need to be there. Because you have no idea. Can I tell you, once you get up above the clouds, it all looks the same. You may be flying over the Colorado, the Rockies, Brother Clarence, or some other mountain. All you look down and see is these little things that look like little green specks, and you think they're trees. You think, oh, look at all them little bushes, till you get down to the little lower and you realize they're big old trees. It all looks the same to you and I, but the pilot knows where He's going. The pilot knows. Can I tell you, God knows where He's leading us tonight. We can trust the one who is leading us because He knows where He's taking us. We can trust the one who's leading us because He knows what needs to take place in our lives for Him to prepare as He prepares us for the work that He's going to do in our lives. Can I tell you, I believe that pit in that prison, Brother Roger, prepared Joseph for that to be second in command. If Joseph would have been taken straight to Egypt and thrown second in command, he would have been young. He would not have had wisdom or known what to do. God would have never been able to have done what He did through Joseph. But God knew, hey, I've got to take him through some things so that he'll be prepared when I get him where he's going. Can I tell you, sometimes God allows things to come in our lives to prepare us for a work that is out there in our future. Can I tell you, it's not only can we trust that He knows where He's leading us, that He knows what needs to take place in our lives to prepare us, but we also can trust the one who is leading us because He knows the way. He knows the way. He's never gotten lost. There's probably not a hand in this room that go up and say, I've never, ever, ever gotten lost. We've all been lost at least a time or two. Can I tell you, God has never gotten lost. He's never led a child of His down a way and said, whoops, I missed it this time. I didn't mean to send him down that track. I didn't mean to send her down that way. No, He's never done that, Brother Clarence. He knows the way. There's only one thing that you and I are required to do. You know what that is? To trust Him. To trust Him as He pilots us, as He leads us, is to trust Him. Can I tell you, He was faithful to Joseph in leading him. Can I tell you, He's been faithful to all the great saints of God since Joseph. And Brother Tom, He's not going to start failing us tonight. He'll lead you. He'll lead me. If we will just trust Him and allow Him to, He will be faithful in leading us. God has a place that He's leading us to. He knows the way. He just is looking for you and I to trust Him and follow Him. He's got a work for us to do, and He's preparing us along the way for the work that He wants us to do. Can I tell you, one day like Joseph, we may be able to stand, Brother Tom, and testify, I'm in the place that God has for me. And look back and say, well, man, I didn't understand why that had to be, or why this had to happen, or why that took place in my life. But we can look back and see God's hand in it all, that He was faithfully piloting us to where He was leading us. We see Joseph's faithful God. We see His faithful presence. We see His faithful piloting, but I also want us to notice the third thing tonight, His faithful planning. His faithful planning. Notice with me, if you would, verse 20 of our text. But as for you, ye thought evil against me. But God meant it unto good to bring to pass, as it is this day, notice this last phrase, to save much people alive. Can I tell you, Joseph understands God's plan for his life at this moment. He understands his plan was that God put him there to save much people. Not only his own family, but others. He put him in a place where he could do it. At this point, Joseph is able to look back and see the dreams, the hatred of his brothers, the pit, the slavery of Potiphar's house, those false accusations, the prison, being forgotten, Pharaoh's dreams, all of these things. Him finally being exalted to second in command in the kingdom. And he can look back and see this was all part of God's plan for his life. God's plan. Can I tell you, he can look back now, Brother Tom, and see the good things. The being exalted. The being able to interpret the dreams, those things. He can look back on those good things and say, man, that was part of God's plan. But he can also look back at those bad things. The pit, the prison, false accusations, look back and say, that was part of God's plan as well. It was all part of God's plan. Can I tell you, everything that took place in Joseph's life was part of the plan of God. Part of the plan of God. Can I tell you tonight, just like in Joseph's life, God has a plan for you, for me, for each one of his children. And though those plans may be a little different, although those plans may be have a few things that are different, though we may face, Brother Tom, different things, one thing is for certain, that everything that comes into our lives, God wants to use them to complete his plan. All of these things in Joseph's life were part of God faithfully completing the plan he had for Joseph. It was that plan he had. Can I tell you, if we're going to complete his plan for our lives, we must trust him in everything that he allows to come into our lives and allow him to use those things. Brother Tom, I was reminded of the verse over in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, where the Bible says this, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to his purpose. We see here that all things work together. The good things, the bad things, the indifferent things, all things work together for good. But you notice there's kind of a contingency. We like to quote that first part, that all things work together for good to them that love God. But it also says to them who are called according to his purpose. That requires you and I doing his purpose. If we're trying to do his purpose, can I tell you, everything that comes into our life, good, bad, and ugly, it is all for the glory of God. God is going to use it some way, somehow. And Joseph here was trying to he was living according to God's purpose. And you can see how that God took everything, the good, the bad, and worked it together for Joseph's good. And God was able to accomplish his purpose and his plan in Joseph's life. Can I tell you, Joseph had a faithful God. But can I remind you this evening that Joseph's God, if you're saved tonight, is your God. He's still a faithful God. I wonder tonight, do we trust him with our life? Do we let God have control? Can I tell you, there were probably some scary times in Joseph's life when his life seemed to be out of control. But can I tell you, though it may have been out of Joseph's control, it was never out of God's control. Sometimes we take our hands off our life. We think, well, if I take my hands off, hey, it's going to be out of control. No, if we take our hands off, it'll be fully in his control. And we won't have to worry about, sometimes we keep our hands on Brother Roger, and we make a mess of things. But if we just learn to trust him tonight, let him have control, he'll never lead us down the wrong way. I wonder tonight, do we trust him enough? Do we trust him with our life, not only to let him have control, but do we trust him to let him lead us? Are we willing to follow him anywhere? Anywhere. See, a lot of times we say, well, Lord, I'll follow you here or there. But are we willing to follow God anywhere? Say, preacher, that seems to be scary. Not if he's in control. Not when we're serving him. Not when we can trust him tonight. Look throughout your Bible. Look at those who surrendered their life, those who let God lead them. Can I tell you, he didn't do any of them wrong. God blessed all of them. God never said, whoops, I messed up. I made a mistake. And he's not going to do it with you tonight. Let God have control. Can I tell you what you'll find if we'll trust the Lord with our life, if we'll let him have control, if we'll let him lead our lives? Can I tell you what you'll find? You'll find that he is faithful. You'll find that as he leads, he's faithful in his presence. He's faithful in his piloting. He'll faithfully lead you. He'll never lead you astray. But you also find him faithful to his planning. His plan will be accomplished. His purpose will be accomplished if we'll just simply trust him. The question tonight is this: will we trust him? Joseph did. If we could pull Joseph out of heaven tonight and say, Joseph, was it worth it? Was it worth it to follow the Lord? Was it worth it to trust the Lord? Do you have any regrets? I believe he'd say not a one. Joseph, would you change anything? I believe honestly tonight he'd say, I wouldn't change a thing. I'd go to the pit again. I'd go to the prison house. It was worth the false accusations. It was worth everything for God's plan to be accomplished. Can I promise you tonight, if we will trust him, I promise you, he will be faithful. Joseph's faithful God. We have a faithful God tonight. We ought to trust him, and we ought to be thankful that he is faithful. I'm telling you, if he was as faithful to me, Brother Tom, as I was to him, I'd be in a mess tonight. But thank God he's always faithful. I wish I could say, Brother Clarence, I've always been there where God wanted me to be, but I haven't. But he's always been where I needed him to be. He's always been there with me. He's never let me down one time. Thank the Lord tonight for our faithful God. Let's stand to our feet, heads bowed, eyes closed. Sister Missy, if you'll come to the piano for just a moment. As she's making her way